Utica, North Africa. April, 46 BCE. The civil war is over. Julius Caesar has crushed the last Republican army at the Battle of Thapsus, and across the Mediterranean world, men who once stood against him are surrendering, negotiating, begging for mercy. Caesar is famously generous to his enemies. He wants them alive and grateful, monuments to his magnanimity. He has already pardoned dozens of senators, generals, and aristocrats who fought against him. The terms are simple: acknowledge Caesar's authority and live. From Utica, a dusty port city on the coast of what is now Tunisia, Caesar sends private word through intermediaries. Tell Cato to come to me. Tell him I will forgive him. Tell him I will honor him. The message travels from hand to hand until it reaches the man it was meant for. Cato reads the opening lines, recognizes what it is, and sets it down without finishing it. He does not need to read further. He already knows his answer. Marcus Porcius Cato was born in 95 BCE into Rome's governing class. Both his parents died before he turned 4 years old. He and his siblings were raised in the house of their uncle, the tribune Livius Drusus, where the corridors were full of senators and lawyers arguing over the future of the republic. From childhood, Cato was noticed for a quality that made adults uncomfortable. He could not be moved. When his uncle's powerful friends tried to charm him, he was polite and unmoved. When older boys bullied him, he neither fled nor retaliated impulsively. He waited, observed, and acted only when he was certain. His tutor, a Stoic philosopher named Sarpedon, recognized what he was dealing with. "This child is not being raised," he reportedly said. "He is being revealed." At 18, Cato discovered the Stoic philosophers and something locked into place. The Stoics taught that the only genuine good in human life is virtue, wisdom, justice, courage, self-discipline. Everything else, wealth, reputation, even physical survival, belongs to the category of things that simply happen to you outside your control, morally neutral. What matters is how you respond. Cato did not treat this as philosophy. He treated it as training instructions. He walked barefoot through Rome in winter, hardening himself against discomfort. He ate plainly when he could have eaten lavishly. He trained his body in heat and cold. He made himself practice the emotions he wanted to master: patience, calm, indifference to insult. He was not building endurance for its own sake. He was building a self that could not be purchased, pressured, or broken. He understood, even young, that the day would come when someone would try. He entered Roman politics in his late 20s with a single declared purpose: to stop the corruption that was consuming the republic from within. Rome in the 1st century BCE was a city where positions were bought, courts were bribed, and the line between law and power had become entirely theoretical. Cato became a quaestor, a financial official, and immediately appended 2 decades of embedded corruption in the treasury, prosecuting officials who had stolen public funds, recovering money everyone assumed was simply gone. He refused gifts that every other official accepted. He returned the money. He forced creditors to meet their obligations. His colleagues were baffled and then angry. Cato was not interested in their anger. He had one question about any proposed action: is it right or is it not? Everything else followed from there. His most famous enemy arrived in the form of Julius Caesar, and their conflict defined Roman politics for 2 decades. Caesar was brilliant, charismatic, and completely transactional. He saw the republic's rules as tools when useful and obstacles when not. Cato saw them as the thing itself. When Caesar attempted to use illegal procedures to push through land reforms that would benefit his veteran soldiers, Cato stood on the Senate floor and simply talked, for hours, without stopping, past the point when legislation could legally be voted on, a filibuster that consumed the entire session. Caesar had Cato arrested. The Senate refused to continue business in his absence. Caesar, outmaneuvered, ordered him released. The exchange told both men something important. Caesar understood that Cato could not be bought. Cato understood that Caesar would eventually choose power over the republic's rules. They were both correct. In January of 49 BCE, Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon River with his army, an act that Roman law defined as treason, the beginning of civil war. The Senate, the Republic, the constitution that had governed Rome for 4 centuries, all of it now depended on whether Pompey and the senatorial forces could stop him. Cato joined Pompey's side. He was honest about his reasons. He did not trust Pompey, did not particularly like him, and knew that Pompey was himself an ambitious man who had bent Rome's laws for his own benefit. But the Republic had to be defended, and this was the available army. When Pompey was murdered in Egypt after his defeat at Pharsalus, most of the Republican resistance disintegrated. Officers surrendered. Allies negotiated. The cause looked irretrievably lost. Cato gathered what remained and kept going. What followed is one of the most extraordinary military marches in ancient history. Cato led roughly 10,000 men across the Libyan desert, the Sahara, for 30 days, on foot, without maps, through terrain that had no precedent in Roman military experience. The desert killed men with heat, thirst, and venom. Serpents of species the Romans had no names for came at night. Men went mad from dehydration. The sand consumed their supplies and their certainty. Cato walked the entire route on foot. He had horses available. He refused to ride while his soldiers walked. He distributed water from his own supply when soldiers collapsed. He kept moving. When the column finally emerged from the desert and reached Utica, on the northern coast, the survivors were something different from an army. They were men who had followed a human being through hell and come out the other side. Utica was the last significant Republican stronghold in the West. Caesar's final victory at Thapsus left Cato with the remnants of an army, a city full of frightened civilians, and a political situation that any rational calculation would call hopeless. His allies began making their own arrangements. Merchants and local officials approached Caesar's intermediaries quietly. Cato watched them go without reproach. He did not believe in forcing men to die for a cause they no longer accepted. He organized transport ships so that those who wished to flee could flee safely. He distributed the treasury fairly among those who remained. He conducted himself as if he were still the governor of a functioning republic, because in the only sense that mattered to him, the moral sense, he was. The forms had to be honored even when the substance was gone. That was what civilization meant. On the last evening of his life, Cato hosted a dinner. His guests were his son, several close friends, and a pair of Stoic philosophers who had traveled to be with him. The conversation was philosophical. They debated whether a truly good man could ever be harmed by external events, or whether virtue was a complete protection in itself. Cato argued both sides with precision, the way a man does when he has already settled the question privately and is now testing it from every angle. He ate simply. He laughed at a story someone told. He asked after people's families. When the meal ended and his guests were gone, he made sure once more that the harbor was clear and the transport ships ready. Then he went to his room. On the table was his sword. On the table was a copy of Plato's Phaedo. The Phaedo is Plato's account of Socrates on the last day of his life, the conversation about the soul's immortality, and then the death itself, calm, deliberate, chosen. Cato read it twice. He had read it before, but he read it again that night. Socrates had been offered escape. Friends had arranged it, bribed the guards, left the door open. Socrates refused. The argument was not complicated. Accepting survival on those terms would mean ratifying the verdict against him, conceding that Athens had the right to condemn him for the crime of thinking honestly. The soul that survived by betraying itself was not, in any meaningful sense, the soul worth saving. Cato put the book down and understood that he and Socrates were in the same conversation, separated by 4 centuries. Caesar's pardon would purchase his body at the cost of everything that made the body worth pardoning. When Caesar received the news that Cato was dead, he made a remark that has survived 2,000 years. Cato, I grudge you your death, as you would have grudged me the pardon. It is the most precise thing Julius Caesar ever said. He understood what had happened. He could not defeat Cato by winning. He could only have defeated him by making him ask for mercy, and Cato had denied him that. The victory at Thapsus, the conquest of North Africa, the end of the Civil War, none of it had touched Cato. The man had simply stepped outside the frame where Caesar's power operated. Caesar would become dictator and then be killed for it. The republic he had defeated would slowly become an empire. But in the libraries and academies of the ancient world, something interesting was happening. Cato was becoming permanent. 2,000 years after his death, Cato the Younger served as the West's standard for what uncorrupted political commitment looked like. Cicero wrote long defenses of him within months of his death. Seneca, a century later, held him up as the Stoic ideal, the man who proved that virtue could survive everything except the choice to abandon it. Dante placed Cato as the guardian at the entrance to purgatory, the figure chosen to represent moral seriousness at the threshold between corruption and redemption. George Washington's troops performed a play about him at Valley Forge during the worst winter of the American Revolution. For those soldiers, half frozen and half starved, the story of a man who had chosen principle over survival was not history. It was instruction. The Stoic argument is that virtue is the only genuine good. Cato did not argue this. He demonstrated it in the one currency that cannot be counterfeited, the life he chose to live, and the way he chose to end it.